We also here have Pak Heru. Hello, Pak
Oh yeah,
Heru.
Pak Heru.
Tio, this is from professional. I think Pak Tio also graduated from, no, not you. Is it from UNSW? Sorry. And
Oh, Pak
also,
Tio.
yeah, we do have Ibu Ririn here. Hi, Ibu Ririn. Okay, yeah, we can start, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Ririn. I think we should start. Sorry, the recording. I would pin myself. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to join this guest lecture series 2022. Now we will have Dr. Kelum Palipane here. Hello, Kelum.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for making time. We'll talk about informality and its implication for design. So I have to remind you that this is a continuation of our guest lecture series, which is now happening in 2022. We already had it last year also. So this guest lecture is part of the collaboration between the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development of ITB and the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, the University of Melbourne. Before I start, I would read Kelum's bio. Dr. Kelum Palipane is a lecturer in architectural design at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, University of Melbourne. Kelum is a graduate of architecture with experience in several practices based in Melbourne and overseas. She obtained her PhD by Creative Works from the University of Melbourne. Kelum's doctoral research involved developing a design framework that would help retain and foster the diverse placemaking practices of multicultural communities in neighborhood regeneration projects. Through her research and teaching, Kelum investigates how multimodal mapping and creative ethnographic methods can inform design in demographically complex urban conditions. That's an awesome bio, Kelum. Before we start, I would like to invite everyone here, all the attendants, if you have any question during the lecture, please feel free to put it in the chat box, or else you can raise your hand after the lecture so we can discuss it right away. All right, so I invite Kelum to probably start the share screen and head over to you.
Thanks, Rora. Share my screen and here. Yep. Okay. Awesome. So, thank you for having me. And I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting to you today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So my research typically looks at, as Roro mentioned, placemaking practices of multicultural communities, mostly here in Melbourne. And I like to see how that knowledge can expand our conceptual understanding of the possibilities of space. I'm looking at 2 case studies today and their design implications as well. So first is Footscray, which is a inner city Melbourne suburb, through which I'll illustrate some of the methods that I engage in, as well as some of the findings that have these sort of design implications. So Footscray is an intensely culturally diverse suburb, and it's undergoing urban regeneration. I'll briefly situated in urban regeneration discourse and then go through some of the findings. So the physical and spatial changes which entail regeneration are overwhelmingly approached through a strong visual spatial approach that overlook the nuanced and layered placemaking practices of local communities. During regeneration, places often become commodified spaces available for consumption. And anthropologist Marie Pardy argues that in the case of culturally diverse environments, this diversity is used as a marketable commodity through which to sell the image of cities and town centers. While there is a valorizing of cultural diversity, there is also a disavowal of difference, with the activities of certain groups hidden or removed during revitalization if they're not perceived to be adding value to this sort of marketable image of diversity. The presence of immigrants in some ways becomes a desirable element of urban space, while the placemaking practices of those same people are deemed dangerous. And this usually entails the suppression of and control of the sensorial, which is linked to dwelling practices. So they're often seen as offensive, disorderly, subversive, and antagonistic. So this process ultimately produces these sort of sensorially safe environments that are non-confronting, depoliticized, and suited for mainstream consumption. And if you review local government publications, interviews with local council and other stakeholders, it reveals an attempt at social control disguised through sensuous aesthetic terms like order and purity and safety. So there's an aesthetic recoding that occurs during urban renewal, where a stylized, homogeneous visuality dominates, and where the other senses, if not flattened or obliterated, are carefully manipulated through a framework of order and purity. And the nuanced and often multiple identity of place becomes reduced to a singular and static marketable image. So this is not a new phenomenon, and we see it in global South cities as well, where they're going through regeneration as well, and where they might be importing Western models of regeneration or romanticizing agrarian sensibilities through visual cues without trying to understand the underlying complexities of socio-spatial practices or displacing them altogether. So they become sites of display rather than sites of dwelling. So I argue, just as places are sensed, the sensory embodied activities of individuals and communities engage in the constitution of place. And the significance of this is that a sensuospatial analysis of place provides a framework through which we can analyze the interplay between the physical, which has spatial and material implications, the cultural and social of everyday interactions. So my PhD work, which is a while back, as Rora mentioned, involved developing a framework of analysis or expanded mode of site analysis that considered the sensory rhythms of how people occupy space and how that fluctuates over time. And I used observational techniques drawn from ethnography to supplement these identified rhythms. So I take photographs, video and audio recordings of soundscapes, write notes, do sketches, highlighting how bodies interact with space. I record personal impressions and insights, and I participate with others in embodied activities like eating and walking, sitting and talking as opportunities arose. There's also behavior tracing and anthropological tracking that involves observing traces of behavior left behind as patterns, as evidence in the built environment. So I want to go through some of the findings related to the sort of unprogrammed and informal activities that I observed in Footscray, where you will see I've extracted these sort of themes or markers that have spatial implications, and by extension has design implications as well. So if you, so here, I talk about ephemeral and temporal materiality, visual coverage, and blurring of boundaries. So here, a Vietnamese grocery store overcomes the inadequacies of the shop space for displaying goods to passers-by by encroaching on on the public pavement space and expanding on to the back of a bus stand opposite the shop facade. And through the insertion of impermanent objects like display stands, protective canvas, sheeting, and produce, they're able to carve out this ambiguous space in this particular strip of pavement that becomes neither wholly public or private. So there's a sort of, at the end of the day, displays are dismantled and section by section and taken back into the shop. The floors are swept, and there's little evidence left behind of its previous occupation, except for the sort of odd wilted leaf and water used by the shopkeepers. In this particular mapping instance, it's possible to see the emergence of a specific type of materiality that results from a tactical and sensorial engagement with space. The shop lends an organic materiality to this section of pavement by bringing in fruits and vegetables. The smell of ripening fruit intensifies with the heat of the day and spatially extends out into the bus stand, where the occupants there are while they're physically detached from the displays by the glass, they're regathered into the space by the smellscape. So also to extend the display space and protect the produce from the sun, blue canvas sheets were used. And these were later, this is somewhere else, but they were later taken down and substituted with blinds. And as circumstances change, the tactical response evolves in small scale, barely imperceptible increments. And with it comes a change of materiality to the place. So this illustrates a particular materiality that is not only vaporous and ephemeral, as we saw with the produce, but a materiality that is subject to temporal changes, shifting over time and space. So this is where I've identified sensory markers of time and place. I just need to go out and play a video for this one. I hope you can hear.
Just want to make sure that there's no voice in this video, right, Kelum?
So here I'll say, so there's this hissing sound of water from a hose that accompanies a stream of water from the open doors of the Footscray market. Each evening, the market floors are washed down and the water flows out and along the pavement downhill. People's walking rhythms are disrupted. They try to avoid stepping on the water. It flows out across this cafe, under the tables and chairs, and it becomes a sensorial indicator of the time of day and the closing of the market. Yeah, I'll stop that one there. Let me see. So in this one, we're looking at specificities of bodies, materiality, and patterns of inhabitation and embodied knowledge of place. So as I sit on the steps, I notice footprints on the blade wall of the Footscray train station. I wonder why, and later notice after the peak traffic has passed, young kids arrive at the station forecourt in the evenings to meet their friends. And while they wait, they appropriate the handrail, wall surface, and ground plane during conversation. Small groups form, chance meetings take place. So here we see the way that the bodies touch the built environment through the exploration of affordances reveals the specificities of the bodies involved. So grasping the handrail, levering out with the body, testing one's own body weight against the strength of one's arms, while a foot is anchored flat against the vertical surface of the wall. It's a stance that's associated with youth and agility. In engaging in these actions, a trace is left behind in the built space as a footprint. And it also highlights the importance of materiality. So the color and texture of the wall allows for the imprint to occur and then is revealed clearly. So much so that others start pushing their feet against the wall for the sole purpose of leaving their footprint behind. So it evokes this action in others, seeing this kind of trace left in the space, right? All right. So this other example I'm showing is about self-negotiation, conviviality, the use of props, and what I call proximate scale. So I see around the corner, street corner near the bakery in one of the streets in Footscray, a group of elderly Vietnamese women sitting on milk crates. I walk towards them and observe them for a while and realize it's a small informal market. I speak to one of the women and she says that she has 5 children and she grows a lot of her vegetables and herbs in her backyard. The excess she brings out about once or twice a year and sell on this street corner. And they're mostly women, but sometimes there are men. They sell the produce straight out of their trolleys and marketing it as no chemicals. And the space where they sit is normally occupied by these tables and chairs off the bakery. So they're encountered at this close range. They don't stand out from afar. They contribute minimally to the soundscape. They don't call out their wares. And there's absence of a signage with any names or prices of the produce that would bring attention to the activities. And their bodies are elderly, so they engage in a tactical action that is quite slow. It's a static occupation of time, spanning over hours with little movement. And in this, there's a kind of self-negotiation of territory between the bakery and the informal sellers, right? So this is, they've negotiated to stay here, which is normally occupied by tables and chairs of the cafe. And because there's absence of signage, one is made to initiate communication with the sellers, to ask about the goods, to bargain, you handle the goods and complete the transaction. So in doing so, a node of exchange is created in the urban landscape that's based on invitation, resulting in a consensual exchange of culture. So this is an example of sort of conviviality that happens in an informal way. So clothes retailers bring out racks of clothes onto the pavement. These attract pedestrians moving from the Footscray station to the Footscray market. And when potential customers pause, the shopkeepers come out and talk to them. And sometimes they seem to know each other personally. Some customers pull out things they bought from elsewhere and show this to the shopkeepers, and they have conversations. And the moment here demonstrate a particular social space that's generated around freestanding clothes displays along this pavement. And in his book, Life is Not Complete Without Shopping, that examines consumption culture in Singapore, Chua Ben Huat describes bodies as expanding when confronted with displays that entice embodied involvement. So the informal character of such displays invites everyone who passes by, hailing one to reach out, touch, pick, and try out items. In contrast, he describes how goods in upmarket sections of the mall are in clearly defined spaces, and they create an invisible barrier between merchandise and the body, discouraging touching, causing the body to shrink. So the space where the body is allowed to expand and engage in embodied activity is also a space that is convivial to social interaction. So I argue that in that expansion, this kind of social moments happen, something that's not fostered in other places where there is this kind of clear demarcation between the merchandise and bodies. All right, so if I kind of draw out all these sort of themes, they clearly have spatial implications, right? And they align with things like messy urbanism, informal urbanism, which have gained traction in recent years with their emphasis on agency and informalized structures within cities. And it's connected to spatial and architectural understandings of agency, ingenuity, improvisation, and new collaborations between public space and small-scale sort of commerce. However, the critique that has been mounted on concepts such as everyday urbanism, which has this sort of strong parallels with this sort of work, because it draws on the sort of ad hoc everyday spatial practices of communities, is applicable here too, in that it does not have the ambition to systematically intervene and change the city, so that it's only a tactical reaction to its conditions, right? So it became, so this was a frustration for me, are we just doomed to kind of tinker at the edges in this kind of small scale way? Is that all that we can learn from this sort of informality? So, and also it became clear to me, the phenomena I was seeing in Melbourne was from elsewhere. People were bringing in their conceptions of space from other places. And I didn't have the conceptual sort of tools or even the vocabulary to analyze what I was seeing. So I wanted to look at countries of origin in the migration process. And I naturally looked towards my own, which is in Sri Lanka, where I have what Rabina Mohammed calls an experiential sameness, where I share language, aspects of identity and culture. So I looked at a place in Sri Lanka called Peta. So it's an intensely diverse commercial district in Colombo in Sri Lanka. It was initially set up as a neighborhood by people of Portuguese and Dutch heritage. You might recognize some of the architecture as well when I flick through this, where the fort area became a seat of administrative power for the British. This was set up outside of that. And so it evolved as this tight urban grid with narrow public verandas and interiors ventilated by private courtyards. So, but now it's more like an open air street bazaar, okay, a wholesale distribution point for markets and retail outlets to other parts of the city. And the grid is characterized by precincts based on the types of goods that are sold. So intersections of the street grid are where there's greater exposure to foot traffic and therefore the most desirable for traders. And they emerge as these kind of micro commercial and social hubs. So I have I did a similar sort of analysis as what I did in Footscray, and a fine-grained and kind of immersive analysis. And it revealed these sort of socio-spatial markers that were being activated and performed across time. So I identified here a graded spatial sequence between public and private, accommodating multiple scales of commerce, goods and services, and social networks at different socioeconomic levels of consumption. The formal shop spaces sell higher-end goods, and the informal sellers from surrounding typically underserved settlements occupy the steps and niches of these shop facades and sell complementary but cheaper goods. And even within the shops, you get the higher end goods higher up in the shop spaces, and progressively getting cheaper as you get to street level. So what happens is that importers sell excess stock to the informal sellers, who try to sell it for a small profit. And they borrow money for the day in the morning from lenders and try to pay it back by the end of the day. And they position themselves in proximity to the formal shops to borrow or even intercept their client base, right? And then I saw an ephemeral and temporal use of space supported by props. So observations across time of laneway showed that in the morning, there is nothing here. And each early morning, goods are unloaded from small vehicles, small scale infrastructure pieces that act as display stands are brought in from adjacent shops and arcades that are lockable, where they've been stored overnight. And the use of these props are interesting because they're not merely micro infrastructure to display goods, but also act to define boundaries and territories. So here, for example, this wooden pallet extends the boundary, perceived boundary of the footpath, adding a new edge to the street, expanding the sort of usable space that the informal sellers have, right? And at the end of the day, this is all dismantled and stacked where possible in facades and, facade niches and sometimes in the shops, and others are taken away. There's also network dependencies supported by the buildscape. So that are based on culturally anchored notions of obligation and reciprocity. So sellers help each other to set up infrastructure. As I mentioned before, some sellers store goods and temporary infrastructure in the adjacent shops, and wait until the shopkeepers arrive to gain access to them. And they in turn help the shopkeepers open up the roller doors, set up their shops. So there's this kind of reciprocity happening across. And the traders greet each other in the morning, exchange banknotes. Sometimes even electricity is provided by the shop to the street vendors. So there's a sense of camaraderie that's cultivated here that transcends kind of socioeconomic levels and ethnic backgrounds. There's also multiple layers of mobility. So interwoven with the sort of permanent shops, the temporary built infrastructure through the sellers, there's this wholly mobile group of sellers using push bikes and hand push carts for high maneuverability. They usually carry perishable goods like pickles and chickpeas, fried snacks, fruits that need to be prepared daily. And they play a significant role in servicing the shopkeepers and temporary sellers. So lunch packets and tea in a small caddy, if you look at F, is carried across and delivered to shop staff. And then the empty glasses are collected by this person and taken back to the station and washed to be used again. And then these mobile vendors respond to fluctuating rhythms, urban rhythms, that are linked to things like school and office closing hours, shifting demographics in the space across time, and to even weather conditions. So, and the street porters, these ones are possibly the most tenuous of these layers because they're day laborers responding to immediate conditions of the wholesale markets. I probably won't go into that. So I wanted to test, what implications these kind of socio-spatial markers had for design. And a colleague and I, we designed a transport hub as a point of intersection in journeys of differing and spatial and temporal scales. So in Footscray. So we looked at the intersuburban commute and of migration. And we saw these as two different temporal scales. And the proposal is considered across these sort of multiple sites following a migratory path, beginning at the Peta district, as I said, in Colombo, to the Footscray train station in Melbourne. And we follow those set of socio-spatial markers that originated in Peta and see how they arrive, survive, and thrive in this new setting. And through these markers, the project draws on the tactical ways in which marginalized communities use informality and mobility to navigate a public sphere in which they lack social, cultural, and economic tenure. And we argue that these tactics can be innovatively adopted in contemporary cities and public space design to accommodate minorities in a more socially equitable public sphere. So I looked up, I introduced Footscray, but Footscray has this long history as a gathering space and meeting place, initially for Indigenous communities, including the Wurundjeri people of Melbourne, and subsequently, because of its proximity to the Melbourne CBD, it has strong public transport connections. So waves of new immigrants came and settled in Footscray, at least as a landing place. And that's why we see the diversity we see there. The train station, though, in Footscray has spatially and symbolically cleaved Footscray. So on one side, you have the population that's older settler communities, Anglo-Celtic communities. And on the other side, this kind of diverse, multiplicitous public of new arrivals. And this train station has divided this. So we propose a public space linked to the train station that links these populations, links back trade and also the Maribyrnong River that was there. So the large scale sort of formal moves included sending the existing train station underground, creating a public space at street level. And it's a space that's defined by these two sloping lawns that start at ground level and rise at level to a point that it can accommodate shops underneath. So it pulls in the sort of trade that's kind of the cultural and diverse trade that's happening there into the center. And then we have this green axis that comes in from the river. And then, and also the station underneath. So the social spatial markers that originated in PETA impacted the way we treated the fine scale, in the way we designed the edge, where the retail met the public square. We extended the shop facades, allowing for a graded spatial sequence between public and private. This was facilitated by this structure, which allows for multiple appropriations. It acts as a waiting area for customers, as well as the public waiting for the trains or arriving from commutes. It would allow for goods to be sold and displayed on its surface, and also as could be appropriated as play structures for children. Mobile sellers could may cater to the shop owners and the waiting public by parking their trolleys overnight in the gaps in the structure. And portals looking into the trains running below allow a sense of dynamism to be experienced by being a kind of overseeing, understanding that you're above moving trains. And the tracks which are underground are evoked by tracing them on the surface. So what our aim was here was to allow us to diversify Australian public space use by seeing what was happening in PETA as inspiration. And it allowed for multiplicity. We are hoping by allowing for trade and commerce at different scales, promoting agency in public space, allowing meaning to be inscribed into place, and bringing programmatic complexity through the ephemeral and temporal use of space. So this is what we were kind of hoping to enact. But again, there was this feeling that we were still tinkering at the edges, right? So, and it felt like it's a fetishizing and tinkering of everyday objects and microinfrastructure, and it doesn't address the future-oriented design and planning processes of cities. But the spirit of informality, by its very nature, its very existence, is a critique of the formal. It lays bare the inequities of formal structures of power, formal legislation, formal design. So I argue that using this potential for critique that informality has, we can reconceptualize archetypal elements of architecture. So we needed to link informality to kind of the formal sort of design ambitions of architecture. So it wasn't really enough to kind of tinker at this kind of small scale. So how do we kind of link it and rethink sort of the sort of embedded paradigms of architecture? How do we kind of critique that? So for example, if you look at I will talk about this a little bit. Yeah, so if you take, for example, threshold, which in architectural terms is the contact between two different spatial conditions, right? Socio-spatial reconceptualizing of it could be seen as a shared territory with a more graded and complex mediation from one spatial status to another, right? And one with new potentials, a space of encounter between public and private. A socio-spatial reconceptualizing of threshold can also see it as performative, perhaps. So for example, in PETA, at the front of shops, footwear is taken off and left at the entrance. And kahawatra, which is water with turmeric in it, which has meant to have disinfectant and purifying qualities, is sprinkled on the ground in front of the shops. And similarly, incense is burnt at the threshold. So there's no hard boundary but between public and private, but there's this sense of threshold that is signified and performed. And if you take program and its relationship to form, for example, through facade, then we can imagine street facades of buildings that accommodate human infrastructure. So not just through sort of narrow economic framing, but one that allows people to network, allow for idling. So in PETA, after, at the end of the day, the street porters that I mentioned sit around, stand around speaking, often through exhaustion, but they're also debriefing, discussing the events of the day. And they appropriate the facade niches and steps and things to do that. So what if we rethink what the facade can be in that socio-spatial way? So these surfaces can allow for changing conditions and the associated change in status to occur in the spaces in which meanings are not stable anymore. So just, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but just in conclusion, Rahul Mehrotra writes of informality. It's not necessarily the city of the poor, as most images might suggest. Rather, it's a temporal articulation and occupation of space, which not only creates a richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined situations in dense urban conditions. And I argue that to consider the socio-spatial markets of informality as generative forces, we need to couple them with architecture's formal ambitions. And through its inclusion, take the opportunity to critique architecture's existing and unquestioned paradigms. So I argue insights into these mechanisms and complexities of informality would inform a socio-spatial reconceiving of archetypal elements in architecture that could help design of buildings in the city that are socially sustainable, specific to place, and as Mehrotra says, formerly unimagined. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelum, for a very interesting presentation. I invite you all, if you have questions to Kelum, please feel free to drop in chat box or raise your hand if you want to ask directly to Kelum. So we continue the discussion session, Kelum, yeah? Now we
Yeah.
have one question in the chat box. Let me read it. Thanks, Kelum, for your presentation from Pak Agus Ekomadio. That is one of our lecturers here. It stimulated to the question about the practices of architectural production, especially the role of professional architects who work by the flow of economic capital. How informality can be the matter of concern of capital owners who will give the task to the architect to work. How about the risk of gentrification if architectural production of informality attract the other people to come to those places and then generate the capital to come? Thank you.
Yeah,
Please.
I think, yeah, so from what I understand, how I see informality is it intensifies and diversifies space use. And that is a important thing when economically as well, when you look at design of place. So I think there's a place for that for architecture, the profession to look at it in that way. And also Peggy Dima talks about, with our changing times, we need to rethink our roles as architects, not just people who design objects, but design scenarios, scenarios that are linked to time and facilitate scenarios. So there is this kind of need to reconceptualize our role as professionals, and also in that kind of at the other end, and as he says, flows of economic capital. I see this as a means of diversifying and intensifying space use. So again, this is all academic and it's all theoretical. And a lot has been written about this in terms of everyday urbanism and things like that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it has a role to play in how we conceive our cities. What role does regulation play in these studies? That's the thing. So
okay. Pak Agus, do you have any follow-up question or comments?
Yes, I agree with you with Kelum, with the architect is not only design the physical thing and also design the scenario. And I have did it from many projects, yeah. Then because I'm an academician, I'm enjoying your presentation about the informality, about the values, but in the practice, yes. So the architect, it's my experience. My question is, do you have the evidence that architecture successfully in the owner, especially the capital owner, to bring to implement or to this is problem, yeah. So in my experience, yes, they accept my ideas just for not to implement, but just to save the economic for the people. After they save this agenda, this economic agenda, they leave the academician. Yes, they put it and do as the business as usual. This money talk. So my question is, do you have the evidence that architects successfully bring the scenario to the owner? It's something not. Yes. I think it's the we have the evidence we can develop. And I also agree with you that architect not only put this physical design of physical, but the scenario. But we need the evidence. Can you deliver some evidence to make us more confidence? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Kelum.
Well, evidence. I feel like it's not design and then they will come. It's about responding in a sensitive way to where you are designing. So if this is happening already there, how do we maintain or foster that sort of diversity in where we design? So it's not like a new, you will design it in this way and people will come and use it this way. It's not about that sort of projection, but it's about an approach to designing in places that are already sort of has this sort of complexity. Because what happens in particularly the West is this decoupling of social relationships and economy. There is, there is not this kind of interconnection. It's not, the economy is not socially embedded anymore. And what we saw in these relationships in Footscray, in PETA, that these are, embedded, these are it's called the substantive approach to economy, where the economy has this link to social relationships, and it's based on reciprocity and these other kind of other sort of kind of social concepts that we don't see in the West anymore. And that's why I feel like we need to sort of look to these places and understand the kind of underpinning social relationships as well when we look at these places, so that we can keep those things in mind when we intervene in those places. So we're not just looking at it in a visual way and looking at the mess and the the kind of materials and and then kind of trying to replicate that, but trying to understand the underlying kind of social relationships. I don't know what evidence I can find of that being successfully done, which is interesting. It might be something that might have to look at, but I think that's what I'm kind of advocating for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Agus, thank you for the question. I will proceed to next question. We have Pak Heru Purbo. I will read it. How the local government reacted to the informal use of public space in Melbourne? Did the government relax part of the regulation in order to support the informal sector? So
yeah. So urban regeneration has been, Footscray has been targeted since the early 2000s. Now it's been almost 20 years of trying to regenerate Footscray. And it's there's always been this kind of tussle. It hasn't wasn't easily regenerated as other places. And initially, the local council had this scheme of revitalizing the shop fronts of Footscray. That means taking everything in the pavement off, upgrading the shop fronts. And then they actually started to realize this was part of how Footscray operated. It was an important kind of level of economy in Footscray. And they actually now, that is being, that was sort of dropped, that sort of upgrading, but there's still this lack of understanding of, so this is all done tactically. That was another thing. So when I was doing this research, I understood that I'm revealing things that are not lawful sometimes. Is being happening tactically in a kind of subterfuge, and so it's just, there is always that tension. So there hasn't been legislative change, and there's always this tension with accessible footpaths, and then the needs of this sort of informal selling. Interestingly, this kind of was in headlines after COVID, when a lot of the retailers elsewhere had to bring out their tables and chairs outside because of COVID reasons. And the councils quickly saw this opportunity of how they allowed streetscapes to be, how streetscapes were vitalized and revived because of that. And they've eased they eased shopkeepers from having to pay to occupy this pavements. But now there's a backlash again. Actually, in the councils are trying to reclaim the payments again, asking the shopkeepers to pay for something. This is a little bit different from what happens, sort of informal selling that happens. But there's always this tension being played out in Melbourne, and Melbourne is not a great example of bureaucracy kind of allowing this to happen. So that's why it's very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Kelum. Bahir, do you have any comment or follow-ups question, or that's enough? Thank you. Thank you so much, Bahir. We move to the next question from Ibu Widi. What roles does regulation play in the studies? Or do you want to add something from your question answer to Bahir?
Yeah, so it's a similar question, isn't it? So it is this kind of realization of valuing this sort of occupation of space, and then trying to see how can you rethink regulation in a way that would allow for the ambiguities that informality brings. And at the moment there isn't. And so I think a lot of this sort of this type of research, what happened after the pandemic of people occupying public space in unintended, unprogrammed ways, it has started being a debate in a lot of the kind of local councils and things. So I feel like it's, you know, a long way to go before there's this kind of opening up of those possibilities, but it's happening. So
okay, Widi, thank you so much, Widi, for the question. We have next question from Chandra Rio, one of the students. Or do you want to ask directly to Kelum, Chandra?
Well, is that okay? All right.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Hello, Ms. Kelum. It's a very interesting discussion. So yeah, based on your presentation, we know that earlier it was a crowded area that was used as an informal activity, right? So my question is how to attract traffic to a site that seems close in an area where initially there were no social activities in it, but wanted to be redesigned into a place that can accommodate public activities. Do you have any specific implementation strategies, or it may be discussed more? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Chandra. So that's what I was talking about. So it's really difficult to say if you design it this way, people will come and use it this way. You know, it's a very difficult thing to assume, you know, that. But I use this example of you know, station design, which I also test with my thesis students. So they're final year master students. We are doing a studio on this of station design, and how, you know, you remember the kind of the kids that come to the station and they linger there. So stations are usually, we conceive them of these sort of efficient, you know, streamlined places. We design them for efficiency, for people to pass through them really quickly. And when you have kids like that coming to the station and lingering, obviously they look out of place, right? And it becomes problematic. Then it gets picked up in sometimes here racial profiling in the media, and then there's negative kind of stigma associated with those kids. It just kind of, you know, it becomes this kind of a really negative thing. But what if we reimagine a train station or transportation hub that designs spaces to linger in, to slow down? So there, part of it might be where, you know, of course, that efficiency needs to be there, but what if there are also places where you linger? So just by doing that, you create the possibility for people to linger, and you create a change in perception. So they no longer look like they no longer look out of place. They're part of this vibrant fabric of the urban urban fabric of the place, just by kind of our sort of design intentions, we can change perception. So I feel like, you know, I don't know if you design spaces to linger, people, will they come and linger? That's another question. But I feel like we do have, you know, the kind of, we have a say in how these things happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, I can't think of specific kind of strategies and things, but that's how one way we can kind of look at it. We can rethink places to change perceptions.
Okay, do you have any follow-up question, Chandra, or that's enough? Or...
No, it's enough. Thank you for your response, and
Thanks,
it may be response will be more. Okay, thank you very much, right?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chandra. I still invite other question. If you have one, please drop in the chat box or raise your hand. While waiting, I myself have many questions actually for you, Kelum. Oh, okay. I will ask one first. You mentioned about the new design, that mostly aesthetic, marketable image it mentioned earlier. That's how we commonly design. And another side, informality have very unique characteristic of, especially in the adaptability. They adapt fast of whatever changes around them. So do you think that even of those, the new aesthetic, the new modern aesthetic, do you think how informality will fit there if the only place available for them is that kind of place? Will they adapt? I mean, will they improve themselves to fit in the new environment, which is probably cleaner, nicer, or they will just go back to, yeah, informality is always like in the, you know, in the visually probably unorganized. What's your comment on that?
So, I mean, I haven't done any studies kind of post, you know, regenerated spaces and how they might invite back this sort of informality. That's interesting. But I also know these, I don't know if you know the case study of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong, where it's the little Manila phenomenon, where so on Sundays the forecourt, which is this amazing design.
I think I've been there, the Victoria Park or something, probably the name I can't remember, but
okay,
I think I know the place that you.
Yeah, it's a Foster's Foster design building, and there's this amazing forecourt. It's just concrete and glass and all these things. But then every Sunday it gets taken over by Filipino maids who have the day off on Sundays, and they appropriate it. They sit there and they eat meals, home cooked meals. They kind of use it as a salon where they're painting each other's nails, doing hair. They play music. So it's like taken over, and it becomes like part of the Philippines for that day. And so there is this, that space allows it to happen, and it is a well designed, as in, well, that's kind of a value laden word, but it is a designed space. It is, as you say, kind of clean, and it's the capital of it's capital of banking, and it's a very sophisticated space in that way, but it's just been taken over as well. So there is a possibility for informality to exist in such spaces. And that's where like legislation and all this happens. So subsequently, because of this, government has cracked down on that. They erect barriers around it, so people can't come in. They police the space. So it needs to be with a change of all these other kind of intersecting things as well. But I feel like, yes, that's a case study that shows that yes, regenerated, highly designed spaces have possibilities of informal things to occur in them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for the answer, Kelum. We have more question now here from Pak Ahmad Tardiana. Let me read it. It's always fascinating to discuss informality as a dynamic spatial practice in public space in the level of discourse. However, when we come to design that for a certain degree need a level of certainties, whereas on the contrary, the spatial practice of informality is about dynamic agencies, uncertainties, tactics, and so on. So designing informality can be contradiction. Respond on that.
Yeah, so exactly. So I will take it as a comment. It's definitely,
yeah.
You know, a space can suggest how it can be used, but you can't, you know, for certain say that is how it will be used, you know. So there's glass, you know, backings of the bus stands in Footscray. The designers never intended it to be used as a backing for displays and things like that. So, you know, so I guess what I'm asking, I guess, as architects for us to do is consider the context, have a kind of a more nuanced understanding of the site and place and what is happening there, and see whether we can, you know, design places in a way that values and fosters these things, and not just kind of, you know, have assigned places for this and that, you know. I guess that's what I'm saying. There's no kind of magic formula for if we design this, informality will come in and you know, this will happen. It's about, I think, for me, is understanding site, understanding place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Pak Abab, do you have any further comment on that? Respond or?
No, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very difficult to, yeah, I mean, it makes sense where designing informality can be contradictory. It's paradox, right? Like,
yeah.
Formalizing the informal, or, well, this is related to next question. I think Gabriela, do you want to ask directly to Kelum your question, or is Gabriela here? Or probably I will read it. So
I
Gabriela,
think it's just what you said. Yeah.
Yeah. Will designing space for informality will eventually make them formal? It's always like that. Kelum, your response.
Oh. Oh my goodness. I wish others can speak up as well of what they know as well of this topic, and you can have a kind of open discussion, because I'm not the, you know, expert here. I'm pretty sure you all have some insight into this. I mean, this things, it depends. You saw the kind of mobile population in PETA. So there are people who have a very tenuous connection to place and to citizenship and things like that. So I can't ever imagine them having a formal designated place. They are a population that benefits from being informal. You know, they use that informality to gain access to economic, you know, systems, to you know, public life and all these things. So informality is an advantage for them. So I can't. So that's why I think my work always looks at minorities and subaltern kind of subjects, who, for them, informality is a way, is an important way of you know, of participating in these kind of formal structures. So it's not just about, you know, shops and sellers and things. It's this group that it's these groups that have tenuous connections to things, and informality is a way they can kind of is an advantage for them. So I cannot see everything informal eventually becoming formal in that way, as long as there's inequity in our public realm.
Okay, Okay, thank you for your response, Kelum. Thank you, Gabriela, for the question. I will move to Ahmad Saiful. Ahmad Saiful, do you want to ask directly to Kelum? Or not? Okay, let me read it. Thank you, Kelum. What do you think about formal and informal itself? Should we keep everything in formal form, or is there any possibilities to talk about it, not only trapped in dualism or of formal and informal? Interesting. Is there any in between?
That is really interesting. I would like to ask Ahmad what have their own thoughts on this.
Do you have any thought, Ahmad Saiful? Pak Saiful? Do you want to say something?
It's strange because when I was first doing the Footscray work, the word informality didn't come into it because it's always associated with global South cities and informal settlements and things like that. And I was seeing those activities as unprogrammed activities that people engage in to just survive in a new context. So it's only after I did PETA, which is in the global, you say global South, and it's, and that association with informality, that I started using the word informality. So I don't know, I don't think, that it came later into the research, that word informality. So, and I situated against formality because I see informality as always a critique of the formal. It's always critiquing this kind of formal structures, and that is as a good thing. So that's why I put it in sort of this dual relationship and counterpoint sort of relationship. But I would love to know of other ways you can conceive of this and how those things can have what relationships they can have.
Okay. Yeah, as request by Kelum, I think if everyone want to jump in and discuss it, this is so it won't be like a direct question and answer. If you have anything in mind, please raise your hand so we can include you in the discussion. Okay, thank you for now. Thank you, Ahmad Saiful, for the question. Now we go to the next question, George Michael. George, do you want to ask directly to Kelum?
Oh, okay. Hello, thank you, Dr. Kelum. I hope my question is still relevant because I also have an interest in rhythm analysis. So I just want to ask, do your research also includes what he called dressage in his book? Like, is there any founding on your research or your studies on how built spaces or built environment breaks in or bend people to act or behave to a certain ways? Thank you.
That's really interesting. I probably want to ask you more about that because I haven't looked at dressage. Okay, that's so my extent to Henri Lefebvre's work was rhythm analysis, where he says everywhere there is energy, there is rhythm, and he can. I looked at it in terms of the sensory. So. And that's the sort of, and I use that as a way to identify the fluctuations of how people occupy space, link it to time, I think, which is essential in understanding place. So that's my extent of Lefebvre's theorizing. But I would love to hear about this further. I don't know if you can speak to it.
Yeah, George, please.
I'm also currently learning about it either. So I just curious about how actually when you contrast the formal and informal, like, is there any influence on how maybe when we try to formalize the informal that we maybe unconsciously like bend people to behave in a certain ways, and probably ends up losing its informality in space. That's just what I'm curious about.
That goes back to that criticism I was making of how we, in our attempts to formalize what we see as informality, we only see it as a kind of a surface understanding of, kind of these ad hoc structures, small scale sort of things. In Sri Lanka, this is about turning hawker, things into like build hawker spaces and stuff like that. And we don't understand the reciprocal relationships and things that are underpinning these spaces. So, and these relationships that are span across, different socioeconomic levels, ethnic groups, and they span across these things. And that's really interesting. And that's something we need to value. So, yeah, I'm not sure if it's answering your question about making people behave in a certain way. But I just feel like when we turn informal things in a superficial way, when we formalize them, we lose those relationships, the social relationships that they are embedded in. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, George, for the question and the insight. Okay, next we have Meta, one of our students. Meta, do you want to ask directly or should I?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on, please.
Okay. Hi, Kelum.
Hi.
I'm so interested about this topic, and I want to ask about insight. Because I see between formal and informality is a clear insight. So do you have insight about social interaction between formal and informality can merge or can create inclusivity in design?
Okay. Yes, so exactly. So those, what we see, my design intentions were driven by that idea of making spaces more inclusive. So when we saw in informality, it allowed for different sort of graded kind of levels of, economic activity, different ethnic groups. There's informality can kind of diversify space use. So yes, I think it has this potential to create more inclusive places. In Australia, I'd say why it was relevant here for Australia was because we have minorities, we have people at different socioeconomic levels. What informality allows is for them to participate in public culture, in economic activities, in things like that. So definitely it does create, I feel, inclusive spaces.
Okay, do you have any follow-up comment?
Can I have define the public space or inclusivity that in design, maybe example or the Kelum has did it.
So the example of the inclusivity in Meta. Do you get what Meta?
Do you mean a case example or a case study?
Case example.
Okay.
Example.
I mean, the case studies I just presented today themselves, you can see how different ethnic groups, different levels of different socioeconomic levels, they're all participating in public life. So there are examples themselves of how informality allows them to do that. I guess another case study is what I mentioned to Roro in Little Manila. So I'll write it down in the Little Manila in Hong Kong. Is where very different people at the bottom of the barrel in terms of social status. So the housemates are allowed to participate in public life because of the informal way they appropriate the forecourt in the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank building. So you can see how that then it became an inclusive public space. Yeah, I mean, I could try and see what other case studies I can pick up, but I hope that that's clear.
Okay.
That's so helpful, Kelum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We still have around 10 minutes probably. If you have any question, we still have one more question, I think. If not, then yeah, we have one more. Chandra, please.
Oh, yeah.
It's Chandra Rio, right? You still mute.
All right, I'm sorry. Hello, Dr. Kelum. It's me again.
Yeah, hi, Chandra.
I have a response like this. You can I would like to get the response straightforward from you. I think the use of establishment in the context of informality is not straightforward. Yes, the criterion of using different physical or geographical location will, in many cases, not be relevant because a diverse set of activities can take place within the same location when, for example, there are different types of production or activity within the household. On the other hand, the same activity can take place in many different locations. What I say that because in my opinion, location as a criterion would be very problematical in a context where many of the activities can take place in a non-fixed and non-visible location. I would like for your response. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand your comment. So are you saying location is irrelevant? The same activity could happen anywhere, or let me try and understand what you're saying.
Can you elaborate more, Chandra?
Right. So what I mean is, based on your presentation, I think it's only for that location only. If we try to elaborate more in other location, it may be more problematical for anyone to applicate it. I think like that. Is that true or not?
So the temporality probably different.
Yeah,
so probably not every spaces have the same kind of intense usage in different time. Probably is that correct, Chandra?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Raro.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's true. Like it's again, that's why I say you need to kind of think about place, and where you're designing carefully, because it's not, one single formula that you can apply and it'll happen. That's not how. So even in Footscray, it's so interesting where like there's a mall, like open air mall, and in the morning there are people walking, Buddhist monks walking getting alms givings from the shopkeepers. In the daytime, there's kids doing parkour there. And in the night, like people are using drugs there. Like it's, you know, it's the same spot. And all these things are happening. And Footscray, I mean, because it's diverse and because it's a very intense place, you know, you see these things happening. But I think as architects, we need to consider that temporality and time as another, you know, part of the architect's toolbox in a way to deal with design. So, you know, it's place specific. You know, it won't work everywhere, but I still feel to bring in programmatic complexity, you have to think about time and these things, you know, as part of your program.
Okay. And any other further comment on that? Enough?
No, that's enough for me.
Okay.
It's okay. It's
Thank you.
I would say that I'm quite interesting with this topic. So yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kelum.
No worries.
Thank you, Chandra. Okay. Probably because we have 10 more minutes. Probably I have a final question probably, and probably you can wrap it up with your concluding remarks, let's say. Oh, so you mentioned that you kind of like against the formality because informality is a critic of formality. Does it mean that you or we should endorse the informal occupation of pathways of any, you know, public spaces? Is that what suggested, that yeah, we have to allow them to occupy it informally, or should we kind of like make a rule or in some extent to make them probably more organized and not disturbing other function and other people that use space for other things? For instance, if in the pathway, probably not. Yeah.
So I feel like thanks, Roro. It's about I mean, I think it has the potential to recalibrate our relationship to each other, you know. So you when you say, should we design things so that it doesn't bother other people, or you know, what if we design places where people have to negotiate? You know, you have to kind of reach out to others, have a conversation, and say, "Oh, can I use the spot in front of your shop? Can I, use this bench?" So what if we think about, it's not about kind of having this top-down designation of places and relationships, but designing places where we create possibilities to rethink our relationship to each other as well. You know, there is this really interesting case study in, I don't know if it's a Nordic country, I can't remember. I'll try to find the name, where they don't have the regulations that we have in Melbourne of this space is only this use. You can't do other things here. It's a public park, and skateboarders occupy this park all the time. And the park is designated as a street. So you can walk as a pedestrian, but the skateboarders can use it as well. So what happens is they negotiate. So if someone's walking across you, they stop and then let you walk, and then they resume their skateboarding and things. So people have to rethink their relationship to each other, rethink their take ownership of how they carefully occupy space, think about other people's safety. So it kind of it assumes people are adults and they can deal with, they can manage themselves and be considerate to others. And I know that's we're talking about very utopian ideals now, but it's about rethinking underneath our relationship to each other. And that's why I think there's always this place to bring in informality into design.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Kelum. I think we can wrap it up because Kelum have to leave in a couple more minutes. But before that, I would invite you all to the photo session. Rois, can you lead?
Okay, thank you, Buloto.
Yes.
We're gonna take photo session together. Okay, everyone can open the camera. We have 4 pages here. Okay, start from first page. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay. Next page. 3, 2, 1. Smile. Okay. Next page. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the last page. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, bro.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to remind you all that this is not the last of our guest lecture series. We will have 2 more MSD's lectures to talk here. We will have, let me check. Okay, we will have Jennifer Day on 25th of October, talking about ethics in doing quantitative and qualitative research. So for you all who want to do the research, this is for you. And also we have also one more lecture, Anoma, by Anoma Pires, talking about theorizing the South. So this is about theory. Doing research in Global South context. That would be on 1st of November 2022. We will publish it in our social media also, the information. So I think this is for today. Thank you so much, Kelum, for making time and share your expertise with us. Thank you so much for lecturers here who are already attend. I see Bu Widi, Pak Apep, Pak Agus, Bu Wirin, and also some professional architect also come. And also our students, our lovely students who ask very difficult questions and make the discussion very lively. Thank you so much. And now I have to say goodbye to all of you. Thank you, Kelum. I will close this session with Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thanks, Roro. Thanks, everyone. It was lovely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right.
See ya
Bye.
all. Bye.